We'd always wanted to spend New Year's just the two of us, you know? Something low-key, away from the crazy parties and the chaos of the city. When we found that house to rent, it seemed perfect. It wasn't very big, but it had that old-school charm. Wooden floors, big windows that let in tons of light. We got there on December 28th with just a few bags and the New Year's decorations we'd picked up at the store. Everything seemed normal, except for this weird smell, like mildew. I figured it was probably because the house had been shut up for a while, either that or it was coming from the old furniture they'd left for us. We didn't really care. We were just excited to spend some time together. The first night, while we were unpacking, I noticed some scratches on the wall near the kitchen. Nothing major, just thin little marks, like someone had dragged something across it, or maybe a dog had scratched it up. I showed my boyfriend, and he laughed, saying it was no surprise a place that old would have stuff like that. I didn't think much of it, but the next day, while I was tidying up the living room, I spotted more scratches by the back door. These looked fresher, though, and the lines were deeper. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I kept it to myself. I mean, it was probably nothing, right? On the 30th, we finally finished decorating the place with string lights and those little gold streamers we bought. It looked nice, even though it was super simple. That's when I noticed the scratches weren't just on the walls anymore. They were near the windows, too. One of them in the living room was longer, like someone had pressed down hard while making it. My boyfriend tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just from furniture being moved around by the last tenant, or maybe just wear and tear. I wanted to believe him, but these marks felt new. Still, I brushed it off. We were there to relax, not to freak out over details. But that night, something weird happened. We were watching TV when we heard a noise coming from the back door. It was quiet, like something scraping against the wood. My boyfriend got up to check it out, but there was nothing there. When he opened the door, all we got was a blast of cold night air. Still, I couldn't shake this feeling, like we were being watched. He laughed it off again, saying I was letting my imagination run wild. I didn't argue and just went to bed, but I swear I heard that same noise again in the middle of the night, only this time, it sounded like it was coming from inside the house. On the morning of the 31st, I got up early and headed to the kitchen to make coffee. My boyfriend was still asleep, and the house was completely quiet. Too quiet, the kind that feels heavy. While the coffee maker was bubbling away, I glanced at the wall next to the sink and felt this chill run down my spine. There were more scratches, and these were definitely new. I'm sure they weren't there the day before. They were deeper, and the lines almost formed a pattern, like words. I couldn't quite make them out, but it wasn't just random scribbles. As soon as my boyfriend woke up, I showed him. He stood there for a few seconds, silent, like he was trying to come up with an explanation. Then he said, maybe someone had broken into the house before we rented it and made those marks. It didn't really convince me, but honestly, what else could I think? We spent the day trying to distract ourselves, pretending nothing was happening. We set the table for New Year's Eve dinner and turned on the string lights in the living room. But as the sun started to set, that feeling that something was off came back stronger than ever. You know that sensation, like someone's watching you, even when there's no one there? That's exactly how it felt. By the time midnight was approaching, we heard that scraping sound again. Only this time, it was louder and seemed to come from every direction. It was like it was on all the walls at once. My boyfriend tried to stay calm, but you could tell he was scared too. We grabbed a flashlight and started searching the house, but we didn't see anything. And then, as we walked back into the living room, we saw it. On the wall near the front door, the scratches had come together, forming a phrase I'll never forget. It read, "I'm already inside." My heart nearly stopped. I just stood there, frozen, staring at those words while my boyfriend tried to act like he was in control. He started saying it had to be some kind of sick joke, that maybe someone had broken in before we got there and planned to freak us out. But how? We'd locked every door, every window, and there was no way anyone could have come in without us hearing. He suggested we just clean the wall and forget about it, but I knew it wasn't that simple. Something in that house didn't want us there, and it wasn't just my imagination. While he went to grab a cloth from the kitchen, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the creak of the wooden floor, coming from the hallway, near the bedrooms. I called out to him, and he rushed over with the flashlight. We walked down the hallway together, and as he shone the light on the floor, we saw marks. Drag marks, deep grooves in the wood. They weren't footprints or shoe scuffs, but scratches, leading straight to the door of our bedroom. I wanted to bolt out of there, but he insisted we check it out. He opened the door cautiously, and the room looked normal, until we noticed the walls. Every single one was covered in those same scratch marks, as if something had been clawing at them all night. At that point, I couldn't stay in that house another second. I begged him to leave with me, but he kept saying we were overreacting, that there had to be a logical explanation. He closed the bedroom door and said we'd call the landlord first thing in the morning. I just wanted to grab the car keys and go, but I reluctantly agreed. I didn't want to fight with him, not in a situation like this. We went back to the living room and sat together under the blinking lights. But the air felt different, heavier, like something unseen was in the room with us. Right before midnight, the house lights started flickering. At first, I thought it was a power surge, but the digital clock and the string lights stayed on. Then we heard the most unnerving sound of the night, a long, deep scratching noise coming from the ceiling directly above us. We just stared at each other, speechless. The sound grew louder, like something was scraping with force, and then total silence. For a moment, nothing happened. And then we heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps. They were coming from inside the ceiling, moving back and forth. I couldn't move. My boyfriend, the one who always tried to keep his cool, looked as pale as a sheet. Finally, he said what we were both thinking. There's something here with us. When the footsteps stopped, we stayed frozen in complete silence, trying to figure out what to do. My boyfriend grabbed his phone and started dialing the police, but there was no signal. He tried again and again, pacing back and forth across the room, until suddenly we heard a loud crash coming from the kitchen. It sounded like something heavy had hit the floor. He wanted to go check it out, but I grabbed his arm, practically begging him not to. Still, he insisted, saying we couldn't just sit there doing nothing. We grabbed the flashlight and made our way to the kitchen, him leading and me practically glued to his back. When we got there, the sight made me scream. Every chair in the kitchen was stacked on top of each other, right in the middle of the room. We hadn't put them like that. At that moment, I knew it wasn't safe to stay there anymore. This wasn't just about sounds or scratches. There was something in that house that didn't want us there. My boyfriend finally agreed it was time to leave. We ran down the hallway where we left the car keys on a small table, but when we got there, the keys were gone. We frantically searched, opening drawers, digging through our bags, but they were nowhere to be found. And then we heard it, a door slamming shut, hard, from the bedroom. It was as if the house was reminding us that whatever was in there wasn't going to let us leave. Without the keys, our only option was to run on foot, but we were frozen with fear. My boyfriend held the flashlight, trying to steady it as he pointed it down the hallway toward the bedroom. But I could see he was just as terrified as I was. We both decided there was no way we were going into that room. We bolted for the front door, but when we tried the knob, it wouldn't budge. It was locked, from the inside. We yanked and pushed, but it was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. Then we realized the windows weren't any better. They were locked in a way that felt unnatural, like they'd never been meant to open in the first place. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. While my boyfriend tried to pry the door open with a piece of wood he'd found, I started hearing that scratching sound again. This time, it was everywhere. On the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. I looked at the walls and saw the scratches appearing right in front of us. Whatever it was clawing at the walls while it watched us. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, reflected in the glass of the window, was something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't me, and it wasn't my boyfriend. It was small, crouched low, with glowing eyes that seemed to glint with a sinister smile. I whipped around to look directly at the corner, but there was nothing there. Yet the reflection was still in the window. That's when I completely panicked. I started screaming that we needed to get out, no matter what. My boyfriend looked like he was in a trance, staring at the window as if waiting for it to appear again. Out of nowhere, we heard another loud thud from the ceiling. This time closer, right above us. Then came a violent pounding on the back door. It was so strong it made the string lights shake, and a few fell to the floor. With each slam, it felt like whatever it was getting closer and closer. My boyfriend dropped the piece of wood he was holding and yelled that we needed to break the living room window and climb out. We ran to the window, but before we could do anything, the house lights flickered and went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, with only the flashlight, and even that started to fail for no reason. The feeling of being surrounded by something invisible was suffocating. Then I started to hear whispers. Faint, distant voices seemed to come from the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but they were repetitive, like a low murmur growing louder and louder. My boyfriend managed to shine the flickering flashlight around the room, and that's when we saw it. Where the words, "I'm already inside," had been on the wall, there was now a new message. This one was much larger, written as if it had just been carved into the surface. "You're not leaving." Seeing that made my entire body freeze. My boyfriend tried smashing the window with the flashlight, but it was useless. It was as if the glass had become thicker, unnaturally strong. Then the sound of scratching started again. Only this time, it was so loud it felt like it was coming from inside our heads. The noise was unbearable, drowning out every thought except the overwhelming need to escape. And then, out of nowhere, the front door, which had been completely stuck, flew open with a deafening bang. A rush of freezing night air blew in, extinguishing the candles we had lit earlier. Without a second thought, we bolted through the open door, not daring to look back. We left everything behind, our bags, our clothes, everything, taking only what was in our pockets. We sprinted to the car, and to our shock, the keys were sitting on the driver's seat as if someone had deliberately placed them there. My boyfriend started the car in a panic, and we sped off down the empty road. I only glanced back once, and that was enough. The house lights were still flickering, but upstairs, in the window of what had been our bedroom, I swear I saw a silhouette standing there, watching us leave. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house. We've never had the courage to go back for our things, and the owner never contacted us about them. It's as if the house intentionally drove us away. Since then, I avoid thinking too much about what I saw or heard that night, but every New Year's Eve, I still get that same chill down my spine, like something is watching me, waiting for me to come back.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've never really cared much about New Year's. Honestly, I used to prefer working on those nights because the store would be quieter, and I'd get to leave early. But one New Year's Eve, something happened that I still can't shake to this day. I was covering the late shift at the convenience store where I work, and as usual, it was pretty slow. Most people just popped in to grab last-minute stuff for their parties. Cheap champagne, snacks, that kind of thing. It was almost midnight, and I was counting down the minutes until I could lock up and head home. That's when I noticed a man who didn't seem to be there to buy anything. He was standing at the back of the store, down the cleaning supplies aisle, staring at an empty shelf. At first I thought he might just be zoning out or waiting for someone, but after a while, it was clear he wasn't doing anything. He just stood there completely still. He was tall, wearing a heavy gray coat, and something about him felt off. Trying to stay professional, I walked over and asked if he needed any help. He didn't respond, didn't even turn to look at me. It was like he didn't hear me at all. I felt uneasy, but I figured maybe he was just lost in thought, or maybe even a little drunk. I decided to leave him alone and went back to organizing some stuff near the entrance, hoping he'd leave on his own. But when I looked back, he was gone, or at least I thought he was. I assumed he'd left, but something felt weird. I hadn't heard the automatic door open or close, and the store was dead silent. I decided to do a quick sweep before locking up. Walking through the aisles, I called out, "Sir, we're closing now." Nothing. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I figured he must have slipped out while I wasn't looking, so I headed to the stockroom to make sure everything was in order before shutting down. That's when I heard it for the first time. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere in the back of the store. The words didn't make any sense. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was probably just the air conditioning or something stupid like that. I walked to the stockroom door, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Everything looked normal, but the air felt heavier, like it was stuffy in there. I walked between the shelves, checking the boxes, when I heard another sound. This time one, and it was a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. slowly. My stomach dropped. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing. The stockroom was empty. I glanced back at the door to make sure it was still open. It was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just in my head. It felt physical, like someone was watching me. But no one was there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It's probably just the building settling or something, I thought. But as I kept walking through the stockroom, every step seemed louder, like it was echoing, and the silence was becoming unbearable. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The stockroom door, the one I had left open, was now closed. I didn't hear it shut, and there was no reason for it to be closed. I walked toward it quickly, trying to stay calm, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was like it was locked from the outside. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I started banging on the door, shouting for help. But of course, there was no one around at that hour. As I struggled to get the door open, I heard that dragging sound again. Only this time it was much closer. There was no mistaking it. Something was moving inside the stockroom with me, and it wasn't human. The sound was uneven, like something scraping against the concrete floor with pauses between each movement. I turned slowly, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but all I could see were shadows. The light in the back of the room started flickering, and a chill ran down my spine. I was trying to hold it together, but my breathing was already shaky. Then, in the corner of the room, behind some boxes, I saw a shadow shift. It wasn't big, but it looked wrong. It was twisting and writhing, like a deformed figure trying to hide itself. I froze. My eyes were locked on that shadow, which seemed to be moving like it was alive, yet completely beyond anything I could understand. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I tried to say something, anything, but my throat felt like it was stuck. That's when the dragging sound started again. This time it was coming right toward me. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my distance, but I tripped over one of the boxes and fell onto the floor. The light above flickered harder, flashing just enough to illuminate it for a split second. That thing. It was hunched over, low to the ground, with arms that seemed unnaturally long. But the worst part was its face, or the lack of one. There were no features, just a smooth, blank surface, as if someone had wiped it clean. Panic set in. I scrambled backward, trying to reach the door, but the thing seemed to know what I was doing. It stopped, tilted its head like it was studying me, then started moving again. Faster this time, still with that strange, dragging motion. I shut my eyes tight, praying to wake up from this nightmare, and then I heard a loud bang on the door from the outside. My heart nearly stopped. Was it someone else? How? When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. No shadow, no sound, nothing. Just complete silence. I jumped to my feet and ran to the door. This time it opened easily, as if it had never been stuck. I bolted out of the stockroom without looking back, my whole body shaking. But as I turned off the lights to leave, something on the floor caught my eye. Deep marks, like something had been dragged across the stockroom floor. I didn't know what to do. I stood there staring at those marks, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, following the marks. They started at the back of the stockroom, where I'd seen that thing, and ended right at the door leading to the main aisle of the store. But when I opened the door to check, there was nothing. The floor was spotless, like nothing had ever happened. I was sweating and on edge. Every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there, but I still had to lock up the store. I shut the stockroom door, trying not to think about what had just happened, and went back to turning off the rest of the lights. That's when I heard the whisper again. This time it was coming from one of the aisles in the store. I froze, my hand still on the light switch, and listened carefully. The words were still incomprehensible, but the tone, it felt mocking, almost like it was laughing at me. I don't know where I found the courage, but I grabbed my phone and headed toward the aisle, flashlight in hand. When I turned the corner, there was nothing there, just neatly stacked products on the shelves. But then I saw it. On the floor, there was a footprint. Not a normal footprint. It was large, distorted, like it belonged to something that shouldn't exist. And it was wet, leaving behind a dark trail that led further down the aisle. I followed the trail with my flashlight, but it just stopped, disappearing as if whatever had left it had vanished into thin air. None of it made sense. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe someone had broken into the store, some prankster or intruder. But that didn't explain the thing in the stockroom or the sounds. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, and I felt this strange pressure in my chest, like something, or someone, was watching me, even though I couldn't see anything. I decided I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I headed straight for the front door, ready to lock it and get out as fast as I could. As I turned the key in the lock, I heard it again. That heavy, dragging sound. This time it was coming from right behind me. That's when I realized the sound was louder, closer. My body froze completely. The dragging noise seemed to be coming from the main aisle, the one where I had just turned off the lights. I took a deep breath and turned around slowly, keeping my phone's flashlight on. The store was almost entirely dark now, except for the beam of light coming from my phone. At first I didn't see anything, just empty aisles and shelves packed with products. But in the farthest corner of the store, something moved. This time it wasn't a shadow. It was a tall silhouette, motionless, but off. Its posture looked unnatural, like its shoulders were out of place. It resembled the man I'd seen earlier in the night, but it was impossible to be sure. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its gaze, fixed directly on me, even from that distance. I couldn't move. That figure standing at the far end of the store seemed to carry the weight of the entire room with it. The air felt heavier, denser, and I could barely breathe. I gripped my phone tighter, trying to focus the light on the figure, but it was as if the darkness surrounding it was stronger. It didn't move, yet I felt it was somehow getting closer, like the space between us was shrinking, without it taking a single step. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt glued to the floor. Then, I heard it again, not the dragging this time, but the whispering. Except now it was coming from all around me. It felt like the store itself was speaking, the words still unintelligible, but the tone mocking, taunting me. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. Finally, I managed to take a step back. That's when I heard a sudden, sharp sound, something falling off one of the shelves next to me. My entire body jerked, and I instinctively turned the flashlight in that direction. It illuminated nothing but a single can rolling across the floor. When I turned back toward the end of the store, the silhouette was gone. My stomach churned. I bolted for the exit, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the lock. When I finally managed to unlock the door, I sprinted into the parking lot without daring to look back. It wasn't until I reached my car that I realized I still had my phone in my hand, its flashlight still on. The beam of light wavered, reflecting my trembling hands. And that's when I noticed something on the phone that made my blood run cold. The last photo in my camera roll. A blur, like something had rushed past me too quickly to see. I didn't even think. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The store was still visible from the parking lot, and for a second, I thought about going back to check the security cameras. Maybe my exhaustion was messing with my mind, and it was all in my head. But the thought of stepping back inside was unbearable. As I pulled out of the lot, tires screeching, I caught something in my peripheral vision. Movement in the store's front window. It was low to the ground, hunched, almost crawling. I didn't stick around to confirm what it was. I sped off, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. On the drive home, my thoughts were a mess. Every sound on the road, every shadow in my rearview mirror, felt like a reminder that this wasn't over. I felt like I was being watched, even in the car, as if that thing had followed me. When I finally got home, I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to calm myself before going inside. It felt like even opening the door could invite that thing in with me. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the rest of the hours sitting on my couch with every light in the house on, trying to process what had just happened. The next day, I talked to my manager and asked never to work a night shift alone again. He just laughed, saying the store had always been quiet, but he let me check the security footage after I insisted. The strange part? There was nothing. No silhouette, no shadows, not even the marks on the floor. It was as if none of it had happened. But to this day, whenever someone mentions working on New Year's or being alone somewhere late at night, chills run down my spine. I know what I saw, and I know what I felt.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've always loved coming home for the holidays, especially for New Year's. My college is about 5 hours away, so even though I like being there, nothing compares to the feeling of being home, eating my mom's cooking, and soaking in the comfort of childhood. But this year was different. I got home on the evening of December 30th and headed straight to my old room, but something was off. Instead of my posters, books, and that old comforter I'd always used, the room was packed with boxes that weren't mine. It was so strange that I just stood in the doorway for a few seconds, trying to process it. When I called my parents to ask what was going on, they just told me they had rented out the room to some guy named Gilbert, a quiet and no trouble at all kind of guy, they said, while I was away. I swear, I had no idea what to even say. Gilbert was sitting in the living room when I came down for dinner. He was this skinny guy, in his mid-40s, with a buzz cut, and this expression on his face that I can only describe as blank. Honestly, he looked like I was the one intruding. We exchanged a few words. He apologized for the boxes in my room and said he'd take care of it soon. But his tone didn't match the apology. It sounded rehearsed, like he didn't really mean it. I was exhausted from the trip, so I ended up crashing in the guest room, which was smaller and stuffy. I figured things would get sorted out the next day. But that night, something happened that left me with this weird, heavy feeling. When I woke up, there was a folded piece of notebook paper on the floor, right by the door. It was a handwritten note, scribbled in messy handwriting, and it said, "You shouldn't be here." I can't really explain what I felt when I read it, but it was like the air got heavier all of a sudden. At first, I thought it was some kind of bad joke. I grabbed the note and went to the kitchen to show my parents, asking if they knew anything about it. My dad just shrugged and said it was probably something Gilbert left there by accident. My mom tried to change the subject, talking about the New Year's Eve dinner prep, but I could see on her face that she was uncomfortable. None of it made sense. Why would a 40-something-year-old man write something like that? And even weirder, leave it at the door of the room I was sleeping in. I spent all of December 31st with this nagging feeling that something was wrong, but I tried to brush it off. My parents were acting like everything was normal, and Gilbert stayed in his room. Or at least, that's what it seemed like. In the afternoon, when I went upstairs to grab a suitcase I'd left in my old room, I noticed that he had moved some of the boxes around. I didn't touch anything, but as I was leaving, I got the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned back, and his door was cracked open just a bit. For a split second, I swear I saw his eye through the gap. He shut the door quickly, but it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake it off, and spent the rest of the day in the living room with my parents. But that uneasiness wouldn't go away. That night, when I went to bed, there was another note waiting for me. This one was worse. It said, "You should ask them what happened before you got here." I barely slept after that. My mind kept racing. Ask them what? That question just kept echoing in my head. On the morning of January 1st, I went to the kitchen, but the house was eerily quiet. My parents were nowhere to be found. At first, I thought they'd gone out early, but that didn't make sense. We always spent New Year's together, staying up late and having breakfast as a family the next day. I searched the entire house, calling for them, but nothing. The only other person there was Gilbert, and he looked way too comfortable. He was sitting in the living room, reading an old newspaper. When I asked if he'd seen my parents, he just shrugged and shook his head, like it was no big deal. I was nervous, but I tried to stay calm. I texted my parents, but there was no reply. That's when I decided to confront Gilbert directly. I asked him straight up, "What did you mean by those notes?" He slowly lowered the newspaper, looked at me with that blank expression, and simply said, "I just wanted you to know." That didn't answer anything. I went back to my old room, determined to go through his boxes and see if I could find any clues. When I opened the first box, my stomach churned. Inside were old photos of my family, but they weren't normal photos. Some were from past Christmas and New Year's celebrations, but taken from strange angles, like someone had been watching us from outside the house. One photo, in particular, froze me in place. It was of my bedroom, with the window open, taken from the outside, as if someone had been standing there, looking in. When I saw that picture, my brain just shut down. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the image, trying to process how this could even be possible. That window was definitely mine. I could even see the old comforter I used to use, which meant the photo had been taken years ago, before I even left for college. Who was this guy? How did he have these pictures? I slammed the box shut and rushed downstairs, ready to call the police. But when I got to the living room, Gilbert was gone. The newspaper he'd been reading was still neatly folded on the armrest of the chair, like he'd just been there a second ago. I went to the front door and noticed the chain lock was still in place. It didn't make sense. I hadn't heard the door open, and he wasn't in any of the other rooms. I ran to the landline phone, but there was no signal. My cell phone still showed the messages I'd sent to my parents unanswered. Then I went into the kitchen, and that's when I saw something that completely terrified me. On the table where we'd had dinner the night before, there was another note. But this time it was written in a different handwriting, almost childlike. It said, "They didn't leave. They're here." My heart started racing. I didn't know if this was some kind of twisted game, or if something more sinister was going on. But the last thing I wanted was to stay in that house with him. I went straight to the back door, but just as I grabbed the handle, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I didn't have the courage to turn around. The footsteps stopped as soon as I touched the doorknob, and for a moment, the silence was so thick that I could hear my own heartbeat. I took a deep breath and turned around slowly. Gilbert was standing at the end of the hallway, completely still. He was holding something in his hands, but it was too dark to see what it was. What unnerved me the most was his expression. There was no anger, no fear, no trace of any human emotion I could recognize. He just stared at me, like he was waiting for something. I asked, my voice barely audible, "Where are my parents?" He didn't answer. He simply raised his arm, slowly, and pointed upstairs. My mind was torn between the urge to run and the desperate need to find out what was really happening. I decided to go upstairs, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to. Each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the top, I noticed my parents' bedroom door was slightly ajar. A strange, metallic smell wafted from inside. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt dry and tight. I slowly pushed the door open and felt my stomach churn. The room was empty, but the floor was scattered with photos. I picked one up, and my heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of me, sleeping in the guest room taken the night before. I started sifting through the other photos on the floor, and they were all similar. Pictures of me and my parents, going about our daily lives, taken without us knowing. In the corner of the room, almost hidden behind the curtain, was another stack of notes. I grabbed the one on top and read, "You're alone now." I don't even know how I managed to stay standing after reading that. Every fiber of my being was telling me to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. I reached for another note from the pile, hoping for some kind of explanation. This one read, "I've always been here. You just never noticed." A chill ran down my spine like nothing I'd ever felt before. It was as if everything I thought I knew about this house, about my life, was being twisted into something unrecognizable. I mustered enough courage to leave the room, but as I turned toward the stairs, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a whisper, my name. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It came from the closet in my parents' bedroom. I held my breath for a moment, frozen with indecision. Should I open the door or just run? Against all logic, I opened the closet. There was no one inside, but at the back, where my parents usually kept their winter clothes, I saw more boxes, like the ones in my old room, but these were different. My name was written on them, in handwriting that looked like a child's. My heart pounded even harder as I opened one. It was filled with things from my childhood that had gone missing years ago. Old toys, notebooks, even family photos I thought had been lost during a move. It was like he had been in my life all along, quietly taking pieces of me without anyone noticing. That's when I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway again. I whipped around, but the bedroom door was now shut. I hadn't closed it. My chest tightened as the lights started flickering, the whole house seeming to come alive. The lights blinked a few more times before plunging the room into total darkness. I stood there, clutching the note in my hand, trying to steady my breathing. The only sound was the thundering of my own heartbeat. Suddenly a noise echoed through the house, a scraping sound, like furniture being dragged. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it seemed to be moving, as if something heavy was being pushed from room to room. My mind raced. Why was this happening now? I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, trying to light the way to the door. As I reached for the doorknob, something in the hallway caught my attention. There were marks on the floor, like something or someone had been dragged. The trail led from the staircase to my old room. Every instinct screamed at me not to follow, but it was like something was pulling me there. Slowly, I made my way to the room, each step feeling heavier, like I was walking through a storm. The door was slightly open. When I pushed it, I saw that the room was completely empty. Gilbert's boxes were gone, and everything was exactly as it had been before I left for college. Every detail, right down to the old comforter on the bed. It was like time had reversed in the most unsettling way. But the worst part was what was in the center of the room, a chair. On the chair sat a tilted mirror, angled directly at me. When I looked at my reflection, a cold chill ran down my spine. In the mirror, I wasn't alone. Behind me stood a figure, completely still, with the same empty expression I had seen on Gilbert's face. I jumped back from the mirror, spinning around quickly, but there was no one there. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. I glanced back at the mirror, and the figure was still there, closer now, like it had moved, but the room was still empty. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I tried to leave the room, but the marks on the floor were gone, and the door was locked, even though it didn't have a key. That's when I heard the voice again, a low, chilling whisper that seemed to come from every corner of the room. It said, "You should have never come back." It wasn't Gilbert's voice. It was something far worse, something that made my whole body shake. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember was the mirror. It started vibrating, like it was about to shatter, and the figure behind me finally moved. It reached out toward my shoulder, but before it could touch me, everything went black. When I woke up, I was on the couch in the living room, and the house was completely normal. My parents were there, acting like nothing had happened, and the guest room where I'd been sleeping was exactly the same. No boxes, no notes, no sign of Gilbert. I asked about him, but my parents just laughed and said they'd never rented out the room to anyone. I tried to explain, to tell them what happened, but they thought I was joking or imagining things. To this day, I don't know if any of it was real or just some kind of hallucination, but one thing's for sure. I never went back to that house for New Year's again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.